The mule went down in the creek bed and didn't get up. Sarah heard the crack before she felt anything, a sound like green wood splitting, and then the cold hit her all at once, rushing up from the stones beneath the water, filling her boots, soaking through her skirt to her thighs. She got herself upright. The mule did not. It lay on its side with one leg bent wrong and its eye showing white, and she stood there in 8 inches of snowmelt, staring at it for longer than made sense, because the alternative was to look at where she was. She looked anyway. Mountains on 3 sides, a canyon wall behind her that she'd spent 4 hours climbing down, the creek running fast and grey with runoff, and beyond it a pine forest that went on until it disappeared into low cloud. No road, no smoke, no sound except the water and the mule's laboured breathing, and the wind moving through the tops of the trees like something restless and enormous. Her trunk was somewhere back up the canyon trail, wedged between 2 rocks where it had fallen off the mule's back an hour before the mule itself fell. Inside it, her mother's Bible, 2 dresses, a set of bone hairpins, and a letter of introduction to the schoolhouse in Pinefall that no longer mattered. She had nothing but what she wore, what she carried in her coat pocket. A folded handkerchief, a small knife her father had given her when she was 12, a stub of pencil, and the $43 she'd sewn into the lining of her left boot, which was now soaked through. Sarah was 26 years old. She had grown up in Philadelphia. She had taught piano to the daughters of merchants for 4 years, and saved every cent, and written to a cousin's acquaintance in Colorado about a teaching position, and sold everything she owned to buy passage west. She had ridden the stage from Denver into the mountains. In October, the driver had assured her the Pinefall Road was passable through November most years, and most years was doing a great deal of work in that sentence. The stage had lost a wheel outside a town called Garnett 2 days back. The driver had found her a mule. She had followed his directions. Somewhere in the 3rd hour, she had taken a wrong fork, and now she was here. She stood in the creek until her feet went numb, which didn't take long. Then she waded to the far bank and sat down on a rock, and took her boots off, and wrung out her stockings, and put them back on. The mule had stopped moving. She didn't look at it again. She picked a direction, downstream, because water ran to lower ground, and lower ground ran to people, or at least that was what she believed, and she walked. The light changed fast in the mountains. She hadn't understood that before. In the city, dusk came in gradations, the sky going from blue to purple to grey, while the gas lamps flickered on in windows, and the world softened into evening. Here the sun dropped behind the western ridge, and dark came down like a door shutting. She was still walking when it happened. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in 20 minutes. She knew this not from a thermometer but from her body, which stopped being uncomfortable and started being afraid. Her feet were wet inside her boots. Her coat was wool, and it was good wool, her best coat, bought for the journey. But it had been wet at the hem since the creek, and it was heavy now and cold. She couldn't feel her fingers past the 2nd knuckle. She thought about stopping, about finding a rock to crouch behind, something to break the wind. She'd read once that people who got lost in the mountains sometimes survived by staying still and conserving heat. She'd also read that people who got lost in the mountains often didn't survive at all, and the article had not been particularly helpful about which category she might fall into. She kept walking. The sound came from her left, a branch snapping, and then another, and then a silence that was somehow worse than sound. She stopped. Something large was moving through the trees parallel to her. She could hear the rhythm of it, unhurried, keeping her pace. Not a deer. Too heavy, she thought. Mountain lion. And then immediately thought, stop thinking about mountain lions. And then the trees ended, and the thing stepped out into the last grey light, and was a man. He stood 40 feet away and looked at her. He was very large, not in the way of city men, who were sometimes broad across the shoulders or tall, in a way that made rooms feel smaller. He was large the way the mountains were large, like he had simply been made at a different scale than the people she knew. He wore a coat of elk hide, and his beard was dark and heavy, and he carried a rifle in one hand, butt down, the way a person might carry a walking stick if they were not particularly worried about anything. He did not speak. She said, "I'm lost." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the creek she'd come from, and at the sky, and at her boots. "I can see that," he said. His voice was low, not unfriendly, exactly, but not warm. A voice that didn't spend much time in conversation. "My mule went down in the creek," she said. "Back there? About a mile, I think. Maybe more." He said nothing. "I was trying to reach Pinefall." "Wrong canyon," he said. The driver said, "Wrong canyon," he said again, not unkindly, just stating it. "Pinefall is north. You came east." She felt the full weight of this land on her all at once. The sky above her, and the mountains around her, and the cold that was not going to stop getting colder, and she said very carefully, because she did not want her voice to break, "How far is north from here?" He looked at the sky again. The last of the light was going. "Too far to walk tonight," he said. She waited. "There's a cabin," he said. 40 minutes, maybe. You can sleep inside." He turned and started walking. He didn't wait to see if she followed. She followed. His name was Whit. He told her this when they reached the cabin, and he was building up the fire, not turning around to say it, just offering it to the room the way you might set something on a table. She told him her name was Sarah. He nodded once, like a man checking something off a list. The cabin was one room. It was not small, maybe 20 feet by 20, but it held a great deal. A wood stove in the center, a plank table with 2 chairs, a bunk built into the far wall, shelves along the opposite wall crowded with tin cans and dried things in cloth sacks and tools she didn't have names for. Animal pelts hung from the rafters. There was a smell of pine resin and wood smoke, and something else, something animal and cold, that was not unpleasant. She stood by the door dripping until the fire took and the room began to warm, and he said, without looking at her, "You'll need to get those boots off and dry them by the fire, or you'll lose toes." She took off her boots and her stockings and arranged them by the stove. Her feet were white and bloodless. She rubbed them until the feeling came back, which was painful. He set water to boil. He put dried meat and something that might have been turnip into the pot. He did not make conversation. She watched him move around the cabin and thought that he knew exactly where everything was and exactly what everything was for, which was the most orderly thing she had seen since Denver. "Is this your land?" she asked. "It's nobody's land," he said. "I built the cabin. How long have you been up here?" He considered this. 7 years. She tried to imagine 7 years in these mountains. She had been here 4 days and was trying not to cry. "Alone?" she asked. "Yes." The fire popped. Outside the wind had picked up and was pressing against the walls with a sound like breath. "The trail to Pinefall," she said. "Is it passable in November?" "Some years." The stage driver said. "Stage drivers say what gets people on the stage," he said. She absorbed this. "So I can go tomorrow?" He looked out the one window, which showed nothing but dark. "Snow's coming," he said. "Feel it in the air?" She didn't. She wouldn't have known what that felt like. When? Tonight, maybe. Tomorrow for certain. And after the snow? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Depends on the snow." She understood then. Not fully. She wouldn't understand fully for another 3 weeks, when the drifts were up to the eaves, and she couldn't see the tree line from the window. But she understood enough. She was not going anywhere. Not for a while. He served the stew. She ate it all and was still hungry, and said nothing about it, because she was a guest. He gave her the bunk. He slept in a bedroll by the fire. She lay in the dark, listening to the wind and the fire, and his breathing, and thought, "I am 26 years old in a one-room cabin, with a man I do not know on the side of a mountain, and no one in the world knows where I am." Her mother was dead. Her father was dead. Her cousin's acquaintance in Pinefall didn't know her face. The schoolhouse didn't know she was coming. Nobody was going to come looking. She thought about this for a long time, and then, because there was nothing to be done about it, and because she was exhausted from the marrow out, she slept. The snow came. It came for 3 days. On the first day she stayed close to the stove and tried to stay out of his way, which was difficult in one room. He moved around her without comment, going in and out to check the animals. He had 3 horses and a milk cow in a lean-to behind the cabin, coming back with snow in his beard and on his shoulders, shaking it off at the door. He didn't speak much. He wasn't sullen. It was more that he simply didn't feel the need for words to fill time, and she had grown up in a house where silence meant something was wrong. On the second day she asked if there was something she could do. He looked at her hands. He looked at her face. He seemed to be calculating something. "Can you cook?" he said. "I can cook a few things." "What things?" "Bread," she said. "Soup. Apple cake." "No apples," he said. "Soup, then." He showed her where things were. He didn't show her twice. She made the soup poorly the first time and better the second time, and he ate both without comment. On the third day, she found a system for the drying rack over the stove and figured out how to manage the damper, and made something that was almost biscuits, and he ate 4 of them. She didn't count his eating as approval, exactly, but she noted it. The snow stopped. The world outside was white and absolute. The drifts came to the bottom of the window on the north side, and the door took both of them to push open. He went out with a shovel and worked for 2 hours, and she watched from the window and then went out herself with the second shovel and worked beside him without asking. He didn't say thank you. He also didn't tell her to go inside. She learned, in the weeks that followed, what it actually cost to live. She had known, in the abstract, that people in earlier times had worked hard. She had read things. She had nodded at lessons. She had not known. Could not have known, she realized now. What it felt like from the inside. Water had to be carried from the creek, which meant breaking ice first with a metal bar and then hauling 2 buckets up a path that was never the same twice depending on ice. Every fire had to be fed. Every piece of wood had to be cut and split and stacked, and he had spent the fall doing exactly that, so there was wood, but it still had to be carried in, armload by armload, morning and night. There was salted meat in the root cellar, and dried beans in the root cellar, and a modest amount, and cornmeal, and a modest amount of canned goods, and that was what existed in the world for the duration of winter, and she began to understand the weight of each tin in a way she never had before. She also learned, in the most immediate physical terms, what it meant that there was no hot water. There was water, the creek, the melted snow, the reserves in the barrel inside. What there was not was water that arrived warm, or arrived at all without effort. A bath, a real bath, was a project. It meant heating water on the stove in quantities. Carrying it to the wash tub, working quickly because the room was cold despite the fire. She did it once a week, and planned the entire day around it. She washed her hair over the wash tub and dried it by the stove, and it took hours. Her hands cracked from the cold water, and the work and bled at the knuckles when she forgot to put tallow on them. At night she did not complain about any of this. Not because she didn't feel it. She felt it constantly, but because complaining to Whit would have been like complaining to the mountain itself. She asked him, one evening, if he ever missed hot water. He considered this the way he considered most things, slowly, without defensiveness. "Don't think about what isn't here," he said. "That's very practical." She said. "Yes," he said. He wasn't being dry about it. He meant it entirely. She thought about that for a long time. He was not cruel. She worked this out slowly, the way you work out a math problem that has more steps than expected. He was short with her, sometimes. He had rules about the cabin, where things went, how the fire was managed, when the animals were fed. And the rules were not negotiable, and he stated them without softening. Once, early on, she moved his spare rifle from the wall peg to the shelf, because she needed the peg for drying a cloth, and he moved it back without a word, and she understood from the set of his shoulders that she was not to do that again. He was also, in ways that took her longer to see, careful. The bunk was hers. He slept on the floor by the fire every night for 2 months and never suggested this was a temporary arrangement. When she was sick for a week in December, with a chest cold that frightened her because she didn't know what illness did to people out here without medicine, he brewed something from bark and dried plants and made her drink it twice a day and sat in the chair reading by firelight in the evenings instead of sleeping, though he didn't tell her he was doing this. She worked it out later from the shadows under his eyes. He had books. Not many, maybe a dozen, worn to softness, but real books, and he read them. She'd assumed without examination that a man who chose to live like this would not be a man who read. She thought about that assumption for a while and didn't like what it said about her. She asked him once where he'd come from, before the mountain. "Tennessee," he said. "Why did you leave?" He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "Things I didn't want to carry anymore," he said. She didn't ask what things. She had some idea of what it felt like to be trying to put distance between yourself and something, even if her version of it was a letter of introduction to a schoolhouse, and his was 7 years on a mountain in Colorado. Christmas passed without her knowing what day it was until he told her on what she'd thought was a Tuesday in late December. "Christmas tomorrow," he said at supper. She looked up. "I counted," he said, by way of explanation. She had brought nothing. There was nothing to bring. He seemed unbothered by this, in a way that made her feel simultaneously relieved and obscurely sad. The next morning she made a dried apple cake from a small tin of apples she'd found at the back of a shelf. She hadn't mentioned them before, because they seemed like they'd been there a long time, and she wasn't sure if they were saved for something. And she put it on the table, and he looked at it for a moment, and then sat down. They ate the cake at the table without ceremony. "Where did those apples come from?" she asked. "Denver," he said. "Last spring. You carried them up on the horse?" Yes, she thought about that. Dried apples carried on horseback up a mountain trail, saved through the fall and winter, and she had made them into a cake on Christmas morning without asking. "I'm sorry," she said. "I should have asked." He shook his head, just slightly. "Seemed like the right use," he said. It was the nicest thing he'd said to her since she arrived. January was the hardest. The cold settled in like a permanent condition. The kind of cold that made the air feel solid, that got into the cabin despite the fire, and lived in the corners and under the door. She wore 2 pairs of stockings and her coat inside, and still felt it in her feet by mid-afternoon. She thought about her life in Philadelphia often in January. The gas lamps, the piano with its sticky B-flat key, the Widow Marsh's parlor, where she'd taught 6 days a week, the way the room smelled of coal fire and the widow's particular hair oil, the sound of tentative scales running up and down under her students' uncertain fingers. She had not been happy there, not exactly, but she had been warm. She had been known. People had said her name in a way that confirmed she existed. Here she existed very concretely. The cold told her so every morning, and the weight of the water buckets, and the ache in her hands, but it was a different kind of existing. Whit found her one afternoon, sitting by the stove, with her hands wrapped around her coffee cup, not doing anything, just sitting. He looked at her for a moment. "You'll go stir-crazy if you don't give your hands something to do," he said. "I've run out of things." He went to the shelf and came back with a fishing net, half-mended, a wooden needle threaded through it. He set it on the table without comment. She mended the net. It took 4 days, working an hour each evening, and she was slow at it, and made mistakes she had to pick out, and at the end of 4 days she had a mended net, and something that felt faintly like satisfaction. He looked it over. "Good," he said. She was disproportionately pleased by this, which told her something about what January had done to her. February thawed briefly and falsely, and then froze harder than before. But the light was coming back. She hadn't noticed it leaving, exactly, but she noticed it returning. The way the cabin was bright by mid-morning instead of grey, the way the snow on the south-facing slope began to crust and sparkle. Whit said the big melt would start in 6 weeks, maybe 8, he said. Pinefall sent a rider up the pass every spring to check if anyone had made it through winter, and she could ride back with him. She thought about Pinefall, the schoolhouse, the clean beginning she'd planned for herself. She thought about this with an odd distance, the way you think about a letter you wrote a long time ago and can't quite remember mailing. She was different than she'd been in October. She knew this without being sentimental about it. She had carried hundreds of gallons of water. She had split enough wood to understand the grain of pine versus aspen. She had skinned a rabbit, badly the first time and adequately the second, and had stopped apologizing about it. She could read the weather in the color of the sky at 6 in the morning and in the way. Whit's attention shifted when the air pressure changed. She was not a mountain woman. She knew this too. Knew that what she'd learned was a season's worth, and that real knowledge took years, and that Whit had 7 of them and she had 5 months, and there was no comparison, but she was not the woman who'd stood in the creek either. In March, he started going out longer during the days, checking his trap lines as they thawed, taking inventory of the territory that had been under snow since November. Sometimes he came back at dark, and sometimes after. She had learned not to worry. He knew this land like she knew the street grid of Philadelphia, every corner, every shortcut, but she was aware of his absence in a way she hadn't been in November. The cabin felt too quiet without him. She hadn't noticed when it started feeling like his cabin and hers together rather than his cabin she was borrowing. One evening, in late March, he came back earlier than expected and found her outside, scraping a deer hide he'd brought in 2 days before. She'd watched him do it once, in November, and had paid attention, which was the habit she'd developed in this place. Pay attention, because he would not explain things twice. She heard his horse and looked up. He was sitting in the saddle looking at her with an expression she couldn't read. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "I wanted to do something useful." She looked at the hide and then back at him. "I probably did it wrong." He dismounted and came over and looked at it carefully, running his hand over the surface, checking the edges. "It's fine," he said. She went back to scraping. He unsaddled the horse. After a while he came and crouched beside her and worked the edge she'd been struggling with, and she watched how he held the tool, the angle of it, and adjusted her hand accordingly. They worked like that until the light went. The Pinefall rider came in the first week of April. His name was Clement. She got this from him directly, a stocky red-faced man in his 50s, who seemed startled to find a woman at the cabin, and he told her the road was passable, that Pinefall was a day's ride, that she was welcome to ride with him in the morning. Whit was in the lean-to when the rider arrived. He came out and they talked briefly. She watched from a distance, not wanting to interrupt, and the rider left to make camp down the trail. That night she and Whit ate supper and didn't talk. The fire was good. Outside the creek was running fast with melt, and she had learned to read that sound now, the way it rose and fell with temperature. She thought about what she was going home to. Pinefall, the schoolhouse, a new start. She had wanted it so badly in October. She thought about the net, mended, the hide, scraped, the biscuits improved, the way his shoulders settled when he came through the door and she was there. "Whit," she said. He looked up from his book. "The rider is going to ask me in the morning," she said. "If I'm coming." He said nothing. "I need to know if there's a reason to say no," she said. He closed the book. He set it on the table. He looked at her for a long time, with the direct, unhurried attention he gave to weather, and to difficult terrain, and to problems that required a real answer. "Yes," he said. "Just that?" "Yes." She felt something settle in her chest, the way snow settles after a storm. Quietly and completely, and for good. In the morning the rider came early, saddled up and ready, and called out from the yard. Whit was at the table with his coffee. Sarah was outside, stacking the firewood she'd split the day before against the cabin wall, working quickly to finish before the rider wanted to leave. She heard the rider call out again. She drove the axe into the chopping block. She walked to the edge of the lean-to and looked at Clement, who was mounted and waiting with a polite and slightly confused expression. "Tell the schoolhouse in Pinefall," she said, "that the position is still open." He looked at her for a moment. "You're not coming." "I'm not coming," she said. He nodded, touched his hat, and rode. She stood in the yard until he was gone from sight. Then she turned around and went back to the woodpile. There was still half a cord to finish before the next snow, and the kindling was getting low, and there was a hide waiting to be finished, and supper wouldn't make itself. She picked up the axe. The mountain was still there. The creek was still running. The cold was still in the air, though lighter now, the beginning of something instead of the end. She had carried water through a whole winter and hadn't broken. She thought that meant something. She got back to work.